Okay, so today we're talking about Article 2, the principles and purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And so the Unitarian Universalist Association is the national governing body. And just a quick, really fast recap of how we got here to today. So the Unitarians and the Universalists were two separate faiths. They started in 1790 and 1810. And they existed separately all the way up until a merger that occurred in 1961. And in 1961, one of the things that they did, and this is really interesting, so just indulge me for a second. One of the things that they did when they created their corporate bylaws is that they put a covenant and, I believe, one principle in the original 1961 bylaws. And so when you read most organizations' bylaws, they don't have anything about beliefs or theological positions in the bylaws. Here, as a church, we have a set of bylaws. We just did a revision on our bylaws over the last year or two, and we don't have anything in our bylaws about theological beliefs. But for the UUA, Article 2 is where the 7 principles ended up residing, but that didn't happen in 1961. That didn't happen until the 1980s. And in the early 1980s, the national body adopted the 7 principles. And so the reason that's important is because all of this is about, as Unitarian Universalists, we are a living tradition. And one of the things that is intoned in that living tradition is, from its inception in 1961, was a requirement or a desire that every 20 years we go back and we look at this Article 2, the principles and purposes of the UUA, and have them revised. And so there is a slide that shows that it happened in 1987, and it should have happened 20 years later, which would have been in the early 2000s, and it did not happen. But what did happen a few years after that, around 2015, was at the General Assembly in New Orleans, a group of people came together and they proposed a grassroots effort to start the 8th principle and to have an 8th principle added to the 7 principles. And as they built their grassroots effort from 2017 until 2021. In 2021, they sent a formal request to the board of the UUA and asked that the 8th principle be considered for adoption into Article 2. And the board said, well, that's fine, and we're open to that, but we're not going to just talk about including the 8th principle. We're going to consider revising all of it and taking the look that is required for every 20 years. And so the slide that was just up is very important because we also operate very differently than most other religions in that we operate from the bottom up. They call that polity. The type of polity that Unitarian Universalists have is we have congregational polity. So it's a flat system whereby there's national bylaws and the congregations and the members, and it's a flat system. It's not a hierarchical system. And so we as the members, we make up this congregation. We vote and sustain ourselves. We govern and direct ourselves. And so does the UUA. So the 8th principle comes along, and they say, let's not just talk about including the 8th principle. Let's look at all of Article 2, and Article 2 is where the 7 principles live. So 3 years ago now, they started a commission, a study commission, with people from all across the country. They did a 2-year process. They had over 60 different forums across the country, both online and in person, and they put together a report. And that brings us to where we are today, because one of the first questions, and Mike asked me the question before we started the service, is we have these 7 principles, so why do we need an 8th, right? So I'm going to ask Pam to put up our centering thought one more time, and that's just to recenter our attention, our recollection. And the centering thought from James Baldwin has to do with recognition and acknowledging of a thing. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so the 8th principle deals directly with racism, and I believe the next slide should be the wording of the eighth principle. So the eighth principle is journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And our first principle says the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And in acknowledging the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the question was asked, why do we need the eighth principle? Well, the 7 principles have been in place since the early 1980s, and as Unitarian Universalists in this time and place, we look around and we see that we haven't done enough affirmative work on that principle. And in the world that we're in today, there seems to be some questions and concerns as to whether or not racism exists, still exists, ever existed in some people's minds. And so we're going to look at a short set of 4 clips that come from the sports world and the world of politics. And I want you to keep the centering thought in mind and see who aligns with the centering thought in recognizing a thing and who doesn't. And so just in a quick setup, the first person you're going to see is the current head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And part of what he's talking about is another new coaching hire in the NFL who also happens to be a black coach. And you're going to see his comments on that. And then this past week, the New England Patriots hired their first African-American coach in history. And he spoke about race in his opening press conference. And we have a short clip of that. And then we have 2 other people that are going to speak and share their thoughts on race. And so take it away, Pam, and show them what we got out there.
You and Mike Tomlin are 2 of the few black head coaches in the league. I wonder what your relationship is like with them and your thoughts on Steve Wilkes joining that fold.
I have a very good relationship with Tomlin. We don't look at what color we are when we coach against each other. We just know each other. I have a lot of very good white friends that coach in this league as well, and I don't think it's a big deal as far as us coaching against each other. I think it's normal. Wilkes got an opportunity to do a good job. Hopefully he does it. And we coach ball. We don't look at color.
But you also understand that representation matters too, right? And that when young aspiring coaches or even football players, they see you guys, they see someone that looks like them, maybe grew up like them, that has to mean something.
Well, when you say you see you guys and look like them and grow up like them, means that we're oddballs to begin with. And I think the minute you guys stop making a big deal about it, everybody else will as well.
I do see color because I believe if you don't see color, you can't see racism. And whatever happens, black, white, disabled person, I've always, even someone with disabilities, I always, for the most part, people are like, when they're young, they kind of make the spot hot. Younger people know what that means. But what I would say is, no, I want you to be able to go up to those people and really understand those people. So it goes back to whatever it is, black, white, yellow, it really doesn't matter, but it does matter so we can try to fix a problem that we all know we have.
This country, take a listen. Yeah. Are you a racist party? Earlier today, Nikki Haley made a claim that the U.S. has never been a racist country. Take a listen. Yeah. Are you a racist party? Are you involved in a racist?
We're not a racist country, Brian. We've never been a racist country. Our goal is to make sure that today is better than yesterday. Are we perfect? No. I know I faced racism when I was growing up, but I can tell you today is a lot better than it was then.
Haley's campaign followed this up with a statement later on saying, quote, America has always had racism, but America has never been a racist country. The liberal media always fails to get that distinction. What do you make of this?
Racism is alive and well and thriving in the United States of America. I actually have a piece that'll be going on CNN.com.
But is the U.S. a racist country is the issue?
No, but I think I believe that systemic racism, which is an outgrowth of white supremacy, which came out of, Reconstruction and the Civil War and became the lost cause mythology, which justified white supremacy, which created racist systems? It's absolutely, just like there's still sexist systems. It does still exist. That doesn't mean that what's in, and I know this in my own life as a person who is biracial, right? That does not mean that what is in people's hearts is always that they are racist or that they have hate. For some it is, but for others it means maybe they just don't have a way to see the other side or understand how we all live differently and experience this world differently.
I mean, the country was founded on the premise that all men are created equal as long as they were white and men.
And landowners.
And landowners. So I mean, you can
And Christian.
You can be honest about history and still have a positive outlook on how far the country has come, but you can't change history.
Ask you something that Nikki Haley said earlier this morning. She was asked in an interview if the Republican Party was a racist party, and her response was, and I'm quoting her now, "We are not a racist country. We have never been a racist country." Do you agree that the U.S. has never been a racist country?
Well, the U.S. Is not a racist country, and we've overcome things in our history. You know, I think the founding fathers, they established a set of principles that are universal. Now, they may not have been universally applied at the time, but I think they understood what they were doing. They understood that those principles would be the engine for progress for generations to come, and that's what's happened. I think the Republican Party stands for merit and achievement and colorblindness. That is what we should stand for. So, for example, in Florida, I've eliminated things at our universities like this DE&I. They say it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's really very ideological, and they're trying to impose an agenda. I think the way it's actually practiced, it stands for discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination, and it's wrong. Let's not divvy people up based on race, ethnicity, or gender. Let's treat people as individuals, not as members of group. Of course, we'll all come together, and there should be no discrimination against anyone based on that. But that's not just discriminating against ethnic or racial minorities. Of course you don't do that. It also means you don't discriminate against white Americans, or in the university setting, you don't discriminate against Asian Americans just because they tend to have high performance. So individual achievement and merit has to be restored in this country. A colorblind society is what we should aspire to, and that's what I'll do as president.
I just want to clarify, Governor, do you agree with Nikki Haley that the U.S. has never been a racist country?
Well, what I said was we've had challenges with how race was viewed. And so, for example, those were universal principles in the Declaration of Independence. And you had a decision in the 1850s, the Dred Scott case, said Dred Scott, because he was black, wasn't an American citizen. That was wrong. That was discriminating on the basis of race. That's why you ended up having the 14th Amendment ratified to overturn Dred Scott. So yes, we've had challenges with how we've dealt with race as a society, but we are the best, no matter what your background is. If you have one place you want to grow up and have the most opportunity, it doesn't matter your background. This is the best place to grow up and to pursue your dreams of any place in the entire world.
What a jerk.
There's 4 different opinions there, and I'll leave it up to you to determine if those people are acknowledging race or not acknowledging race. But why are we discussing Article 2? So the 7 principles live in Article 2, and we've been having a conversation as the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Laguna Beach about adopting the 8th principle, and we'll have our special congregational meeting to further discuss it in an official setting next month. And when we started the journey of talking about the 8th principle and adopting the 8th principle, let me take one step back. Here, we all know this, we're a lay-led congregation, which means we don't have an employed minister at this time. Our minister retired during the pandemic. And so, as a lay-led organization, we are the governing body of ourselves, and we've been in this process of discussing adopting the 8th principle. When we started the process, I myself didn't understand what was happening on the national level with this Article 2 study commission. But in getting ready for the conversation back in October, I shared with Pam In the Article 2 Study Commission's recommendations, it was to change everything in Article 2, including essentially taking all of the 7 principles out and replacing them with something new. And that's where my journey began in understanding this something new. So if Pam, if you can put up the diagram, the picture of the diagram that we have on the slide, the something new that they came up with is what I refer to as a Venn diagram of values. And in that diagram, they commission centered all of the values on love. And so what you'll see is there's love in the center, and then there's 6 other values that go around that diagram. And that diagram is an agreed upon representation. And what I thought was important for our understanding is the 7 principles are coming out, this diagram is going in, but this diagram also correlates and resides to actual articulation of what each of the 7 values are. And it was a little confusing to me, and it may be a little confusing to you. And so one of the people that was responsible for starting the 8th Principle Grassroots Movement is a lady named Paula Cole Jones. And she's also on the commission that developed this diagram that you're looking at. So in a moment, Pam is going to play a short statement from Paula Cole Jones talking about Article 2's new existence and the 8th principle and how those 2 things go together. So she's going to take 2 minutes and tell us about how those 2 things go together. And remember, she is the lady, one of the 2 people that initially started the 8th principle movement to begin with at the New Orleans General Conference in 2015 or 2017. I think it was 2017. But it's telling us that Paula is a member of the commission, and she's been leading the 8th Principle Project. Hundreds of congregations have adopted the 8th Principle Project so far. It's actually 274 congregations have adopted it to date. Now some wonder how these 2 movements are connected and what might happen to the 8th Principle if the new language of Article 2 is adopted. How is the 8th Principle Project connected to the Article 2 Study Commission's work?
Our request to consider the 8th principle was part of the catalyst for setting the Article 2 process in motion. There were some people early on that said, well, the 8th principle should be the preamble to the principles, or this is the only one that we really need, or, you know, there were a lot of different ways of looking at it, and the board was hoping that it would be more infused and not just an add-on at the end. So people had a lot of different thoughts about it. I have said all along that it's not likely to be an 8th principle when it gets to the national level. We knew that it would be rewritten. I said it's not likely to be an 8th principle, but it will definitely be in there. When congregations adopt the 8th principle locally, they have
got here. I heard a no. No. So I'm going to try to clear it up. A grassroots effort was started to adopt the 8th principle. When it went to the national level, instead of solely focusing on the 8th principle like we're going to do at our congregational meeting where we're only going to focus on the 8th principle, the national board 2 years ago decided to commission a review of all of Article 2 with the purpose of considering including the eighth principle, but with a broader command or directive of looking at all of Article 2 as it was currently conceived with the 7 principles and make a set of recommendations. In that set of recommendations that came out of the work of people at the national level that we hadn't been a part of and weren't part of the conversation because we weren't paying attention really was basically what happened, right? When I went to Pittsburgh in June to the National Assembly, that's the first time I saw the diagram when they were presenting it after the 2-year commission report. I had never been to a General Assembly because I'm new to this faith. I've only been around for 5 years, and you guys sent me for the first time. And I learned a whole lot of stuff. One of the things is that it's a grassroots effort. So when I did the service back in October, I told you guys that the 8th principle had been adopted at that time in October by 233 congregations. All of those congregations, because of the way that UU polity works, it operates independently, have adopted the 8th principle. Now the number's 274, so I think that's 51 new congregations have adopted since we had our service on it back in October. What the organizers were seeking to do was to do a grassroots effort, get enough support. When they got to, I believe, somewhere around 75 or 100 is when they sent the request to the national organization 2 years ago for it to be considered as a national change as opposed to a congregational change. The result is a complete edit of Article 2, and that complete edit results in that picture. And the last thing I wanted to share with you guys today is the Article 2 Study Commission actually are going to read to you the written changes that correlate to this picture and are replacing the 7 principles. So the important thing is they did a study and they decided that they should replace the 7 principles. And the 7 principles should be replaced with the picture and the words that are about to be shared with you. And the reason we're going to play the whole thing is if you don't hear it, you're probably never going to hear it. So I found the audio clip for us to hear it one time so we can hear it run through. And Pam is going to play that for us right now.
The Unitarian Universalist Association will devote its resources to and use its organizational powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. Its primary purposes are to assist congregations in their vital ministries, support and train leaders, both lay and professional, to foster lifelong faith formation, to heal historic injustices, and to advance our Unitarian Universalist values in the world. The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love.
Section C 2.2. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant, congregation to congregation and through our association, to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared value. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are justice, pluralism, interdependence, transformation, generosity, equity, On the screen now, you see a diagram, and it is an image of a chalice with an overlay of the word love over the flame, with 6 outstretched arms that create a circle around each of the core values and form a 6-petal flower shape. Each arm is a different color, and they are interdependence, orange, equity, red, transformation, purple, pluralism, dark blue, generosity, teal, and justice, yellow.
Interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. We covenant to cherish Earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the great web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect.
Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect.
Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities.
Section C23, Inspirations. As Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us live into our values. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the religious ancestries we inherit and the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom.
Section C24, Inclusion. Systems of power, privilege, and oppression have traditionally created barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. We pledge to replace such barriers with ever-widening circles of solidarity and mutual respect. We strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons who share our values. We commit to being an association of congregations that empowers and enhances everyone's participation, especially those with historically marginalized identities.
Section C2.5, Freedom of Belief. Congregational freedom and the individual's right to conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union, so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed.
You guys are welcome. So, to be clear, what we just experienced was what the board has accepted and put to the general body as the replacement for what used to be the 7 principles. So one more time to recap. So from 60s to the 80s, there were no 7 principles. And part of this is emphasizing the living tradition of how our faith is evolving. In the 80s, they adopted the 7 principles through the same process that is going on now. And right now, they brought it to the General Assembly last year, the language that you just had, and last year was an opportunity for people to put forward amendments. And so where we are is at General Assembly in June will be a vote to adopt the language that we just heard, replacing the 7 principles. And because we are dues-paying members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, we have delegates that we will name as a congregation. And I shared all of this exciting, thrilling, and deeply, easily to digest material with you because as a congregation, we have a vote coming up in June as to whether or not we would like to adopt this as the change or not. We have one vote, just like at the ballot box, so we don't necessarily dictate the outcome, but I wanted us to be as involved and up to speed on what is actually going on. And then if we backtrack to what Paula Cole said, even though the principles are gone, as an individual body, we can decide to adopt the 8th principle because we think it's important. So in another month, we'll come together and continue this conversation on whether or not we think the 8th principle is important. I apologize to our guests for such a procedural and thrilling introduction to what we do here. But you know a lot more about Unitarian Universalists than a whole lot of other people in the world. You're welcome.